Hello, and this is Dustin DaHusky, and we're going to do a final, hopefully final, installment of why cars from the 70s and the 80s were junk. This fourth episode, or video, really was kind of an afterthought, then I decided to include it. So we talked about, the design of mechanics of pretty much the car's mechanicals. So fuel delivery, engine, transmission, or if it's got a transaxle or axle, or braking, just a whole bunch of other stuff. Then we talked about interior, in terms of plastics, materials, fabric, metals, plastics, rubbers, in that sort of sense. And then, of course, exterior, the qualities of metals, the qualities of the paint, and any bit of rust protection done to it. And perhaps just body construction. So, here's one that I thought that kind of ties in mostly with mechanicals, but lack of this type of subject is going to diminish any longevity of any car, and that's what you will probably call scheduled maintenance. Or I think that's what I put. Let's see. What did I put down on here again? What did I put down on here? Scheduled maintenance. Okay. So, we all know that with conventional oil, 3,000 miles seems to be the magic number. In fact, you could go over 1,000 miles over on a conventional oil change, although I wouldn't recommend going above 1,000 over, and I wouldn't recommend doing it all the time. And as pretty much as oils advance, the longer you're able to actually use the oil within your crankcase. The Germans in World War II were the first industrialized nation to be using synthetic oils almost on a dire need. They can't source oil from Romania once they got cut off, so they had to develop synthetic oil to pretty much run vehicles, tanks, whatever. If it's got an engine, it needs oil. They've developed synthetic oil that will help alleviate the starvation of ordinary crude oil that can be used for other many things. Although back then, you might get 3,000 or even 4,000 miles on old German synthetic oil back in the 1940s. Most conventional engine oils tend to last about 1,000 miles. Maybe you are going to push it to 2,000. At least by the end of the 1940s, 2,000 miles on an oil change was considered advanced. And then pretty much you can only advance conventional motor oil before it becomes fully synthetic. But the most you could probably get from conventional motor oil that doesn't get totally burnt out is with some brands 4,000 miles. But those are few and far in between. Mostly they'll recommend you to change at 3,000, which my last two cars I've ever owned, I've always changed at 3,000 on the spot, although the Cavalier, well, only depended on when I was able to pay for oil. I still changed the oil. I tend to do 1,000 over just to get my money's worth out of it, but then I may have prematurely worn out my engine doing that. However, not so much. I guess compression was definitely going down, just because you keep engine oil way too long, it'll eventually wear out things. It doesn't protect from engine wear. Once it's fully burnt out, then there's very little protective properties to oil. The same with gear oil, axle grease oil, or just gear oil. Eventually there's a working limit to where it'll eventually stop working the way it should. So how often you change your vehicle's fluids will genuinely determine how long mechanically your vehicle will stay on the road before it turns into total junk, because sometimes an engine rebuild costs more than the value of the car. You are better off junking it, which a lot of the cars of the 70s and 80s, they tend to get tossed. And I think I'm going to actually explain one major reason why. And I have a stack of GM small car and front wheel drivers, their sales brochures, because this is a time when car manufacturers were showing you your service intervals, which how often or how less often you need to service your car, which sounds great because that seems to save you money. You don't have to service your car often. That sounds great, right? Wrong. The longer you go between service intervals, the more likely something's going to fuck up. And I'm going to show you why. So, modern day conventional oils go about 3,000 miles. And most synthetic oil will go anywhere from, they say it can last further, but I don't trust this either, but you could put 5,000 to 7,500 miles on regular synthetic oil, or just synthetic oil. You could do 10,000 mile oil changes, which, to be honest, if you've ever worked on a car, you know that when engine oil gets used, it gets burnt up slightly in the ignition cycle, in the combustion cycle. That burnt oil finds its way back into the crankcase, circulates around, and your engine oil eventually gets dirty. That is why you change your oil, is because eventually it gets dirty, which doesn't do any good job of lubricating moving parts as well, because there's more burnt carbon in the oil than there is just ordinary oil. So there's more stuff in it that kind of prevents it from doing its job properly. Your car's also burning a little bit of oil. It's not a 2-cycle style engine. You can have a 4-cycle engine, but it's still going to burn microscopic amounts of oil through valve stems, or just pretty much the way how a piston moves up a cylinder. It needs oil just to glide nicely. It doesn't need much, but it does need a bit of oil to glide nicely up and down the cylinder wall. Whatever engine oil is coated during the cycle of the engine, where exhaust gases are being pushed out by the piston through the open exhaust valve, the piston just moved up once to coat the wall, then ignition will burn it all. So you're burning a bit of oil, but not much. If it's a newer engine, it shouldn't burn too much. But your engine oil diminishes, its quality diminishes over time. And people tell me, oh, well, there's 10,000 mile synthetic oil, and I can't trust that. Just seems way too long. So I would say 7,500 is maybe the max I'd go with any kind of oil. But 5,000 is a safe bet. 5,000 with semi-synthetic, you can get as far as you can on it without damaging your engine. And I'm going to show you why a lot of these cars were off the road within 10 to 15 years. Because eventually they were so mechanically overworn. It's hard enough to know why without looking at these sales brochures. And now I'm not so surprised anymore. And this is why a lot of cars are seen as junk, because the manual told us to. No one's fault. Let's begin. So let's actually kind of go up. Or actually go up from the smallest to the biggest. So look at that. 1982 Chevette. It's a nice looking car. Back when they had aluminum grills and still fully chromed bumper. So, oh wait, never mind. Where is it? Where was it? Where was it? Yeah, that's what a standard headlamp looks like. Halogen would be a little bit more brighter. Somewhere in here. Do they no longer include it in this? Wow. Did they actually stop including it for the Chevette? I may have done a slight oops. That's hard to believe because in later period manuals, or wow. That is so odd here. Let me find a 83. What about an 81? It's hard enough to believe that it's not in 82. Huh. It's not an 81. So I'm gonna guess. Huh. Look at that. 83 and... oh, here it is. Okay. So, oddly enough, in 1981 and 82, they did not put service interval on their sales brochure, but look at that. Engine oil, 12 months, or 7,500 miles. That's insane. Or even, look at that. Oil filter, 12 months, or... well, that's actually for the first oil change. Every 15,000 miles after. So that means you would reuse the same filter twice between oil changes. That's insane. And spark plugs up to 30,000 miles? I guess it's about average. Chassis lubrication, that's nothing special. This is what actually gets me. Automatic transmission fluid change every 100,000 miles. This is insane. That's how you burn out your transmission. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. But one thing that gets me is ordinary engine oil. And GM did not, as far as I knew, I don't think at this time GM was offering synthetic oil as part of its packages. I think you could do synthetic oil at third-party oil changing shops. I don't even think synthetic oil was that popular back then anyway. But 7,500 miles on straight conventional oil is insane. The most you should probably do is 3,000. But to be changing your oil only once a year, I guess it depends on how hard you drive the engine, but still, 7,500 miles from brand new means you're moving all of the engine filings from manufacturing. It's swirling into bearings, it's swirling into moving parts, your oil pump, piston wall, or the cylinder wall with the piston. It's moving all the little tiny bits of metal, and it's all going to wear this stuff out. And that's insane. And the automatic transmission fluid, which explains why so many of these cars from this time period all have worn out transmissions. That's why a lot of them can't really they're not to be relied upon. So now we got disappointed with this, even though it is actually quite a nice cover for 1982. You just saw it just briefly. My favorite car, the Cavalier, which they only made 82,000 Cavaliers in 1982, and they were only made in one plant in California. Oh, wait. Ooh, look at that. Okay. So, where is the service intervals? I know it's in this one as well. Oh, here it is. Oh my god. Same thing. Engine oil, 12 months or 3,500 miles. Oil filter. For the first oil change, it gets changed out. Then every 15,000 miles, it only will get changed. That's insane. Spark plugs, I'm not too surprised about that. Chassis lubrication, that's about average. But automatic transmission fluid change, 100,000 miles. A lot of these cars didn't make it to 100,000. So, and the well, back in the day they were calling them elements, but a engine air filter every 50,000 miles. These things barely last even 10,000 miles, like in a year's worth of driving. So if you were expected to drive within 12 months 7,500 miles, so imagine the amount of time it would take you to get to 50,000 miles, and you never had to change this. Means you're getting bad fuel economy because this filter is getting clogged. Over time, it's robbing you of fuel economy and pretty much efficiency. Your engine works slightly more, which doesn't help for, excessive pushing of conventional engine oil at this time. It's just insane. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's, I find that incredible. And now we got the Celebrity, which, these are cool cars. My favorite part about this whole brochure is this page right here. Not a single straight line in sight. I mean, everything's got slight curve. Speaker, great. It's not flat. The windshield defrost vents, those aren't flat. They're all wavy. They're all warped. So is this one back there. You can see that one's a bit pushed up, and you can even tell the dash pad is wavy and warped along there. Yeah, it's just these cars, they were built okay. They were just not built good enough. It's not to say they were terrible. It's just people didn't quite... Oh, okay. Look at that. So, at least with General Motors, it seems that this seems to be their general play rule. Long recommended service intervals. This is what they recommend. And seriously, how are these transmissions supposed to last by then without continual oil changes? I mean, honestly, I can see 60,000. I can see 60,000 because all GM's transmissions have a filter. Domestic and import cars, German, Japanese, whatever, they will only need to be changed 30,000 miles, but because they don't have a filter, but it's easier. But you go through a few more transmission flushes more often. American cars always had a filter, so you can go a bit further, but not this far. That's insane. And it explains why a lot of these cars just started burning oil. And it's not just the celebrity, it's just all of them. They all burnt oil at a very young age, which shouldn't be the case, but they just did because GM thought either they can push the oil a bit further so they didn't have to shell out for that much oil changes, or whatever. Then the citation. So, you go to a GM dealership and you tell them about an X body, they're going to look at you very strangely. Also, it's got hoosks. Look at that. It's got 2 hooks. And there's a butt of 1 hoosk right there. But, so this should have a service interval. It's somewhere in here. Here. It's just long recommended service intervals. And now this is, the first time I've seen under ideal conditions. See owner's manual for conditions requiring more frequent intervals. But if they're saying that you can get away with that, Ford and Chrysler is probably not that far behind in terms of doing something like this as well. This is just insane. Now, this is a bit more... This is even still a bit long on the tooth for an air filter, but 30,000 miles is better than 50, but still a bit too long. You're better off changing them out every 10 or 15,000 miles. They really shouldn't stay there that long. And again, long intervals for engine oil, incredibly long intervals for engine oil filter, which really is insurance for your engine. If you don't change your filter often, or if you don't change your filter every single time you change your oil, you're literally risking future engine damage, which a lot of these cars did. Spark plugs, again, that's pretty typical. There was something on my screen and I swiped. And then this shit, 100,000 miles, I still can't believe that. Chassis lubrication, yeah. So, these cars, if they were maintained the way how conventional oil should be maintained, we'd honestly see more of these things on the road. Well, maybe not specifically this car, because the Citation was a really horribly designed car. They looked great, but execution is just not there. Though, if people understood the limitations of engine oil, we'd be seeing a lot more of these cars. And you know what? A lot of these have just fallen apart. The X-Body, quite literally, because they were just not that well built. I don't know, it's just... It's insane to think that manufacturers push this kind of interval for basic stuff. Now, more mechanical stuff, brakes, whatnot, adjustments, that would seem quite more realistic because that stuff wears out like anything more regularly. So you're going to change those out whenever they need to. And brake pads have come a long way, but by the 1980s, they perfected them enough to where they lasted a good long time. But I'd say you're getting about anywhere from like 10 to 25% more brake pad life in today's pads. They just kind of figure out how to make them better. Although, don't tell them because they're going to find ways to not make them well, that you're going to be changing them out of every 3,000 miles, which I had done so with my Cavalier, and that was stupid. So, what do we take in from all these sales brochures? It shows that the car manufacturer was certainly trying to, on purpose, because they know they're going to make millions of these cars. So they're going to actually try to find ways to take them off the road so that people can buy more of them in about 5-7 years' time. So they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that happens. Or even by 10 years, they're going to be so riddled with mechanical tolerances that just don't match up. People are going to be forced to either do an expensive engine rebuild, which few people did. It's not to say they didn't, few people did. A lot of people just didn't. They just junked the car. They realized they couldn't get much from it. Mechanics were about the only ones that were still able to rebuild these cars, but that's because they literally took the cars for next to nothing. So you have to really wonder the bad rap that a lot of these cars from these time periods got was due to their service intervals, that they were way too long. And if people really actually follow them like that, it would make perfect sense why an engine would burn so much oil long before it hits 100,000 miles. Just makes sense. My Skylark was always burning oil. But that's a car from the 1960s with 1960s period tolerances. And honestly, that's perfectly normal. By the 1980s, you shouldn't be burning that much oil. And yet, a lot of gasoline-powered cars, not just diesels. Diesels just always naturally produce soot. But if you're able to actually have a tight engine for your car at that point in time, and it reaches 100,000 miles, you were doing pretty good. Then compression would rapidly decline. Once you get past 100,000 or even 150,000 at the most, that's when you see compression really start to drop, just because the earlier service interval really worn these engines out fast, wore out transmissions fast. Clogged engine air filters would help struggle these engines work even harder. Then later in life, when these engines are way too worn out, now, just because we know to change oil at 3,000 miles, now these engines finally do get their 3,000 mile interval, but it's too late at that point. Unless you can find a really mint engine or a car that was never driven much. Bruiser finds some really cool gems that are mostly under 100,000 miles and just clean as can be. So you can find some really cool, clean examples with engines that are probably going to be incredibly tight. And even if they did follow those recommended long interval services, it probably didn't do enough engine damage at that point, and it seems that a lot of the people that bought these cars turned out to be their coffin cars, pretty much older people that would buy a car and would probably use it until the end of their days. And it seems celebrities, older Cavaliers, they tend to be cars that do this job incredibly well, that I've noticed. Mostly the front-wheel drive A bodies, just perfect example of that. So what could say what really killed the 1970s or 80s cars? And I just have to say, as far as anything is concerned, Americans need to wash their cars more, especially in the Midwest, because the rust is going to kill the car before anything else does. And if rust doesn't kill the car, the long service intervals will. However, that'll only kill the engine of the car. The rest of the car will still be fine. Swap out another engine or rebuild an engine. That way you know it's going to be tight tolerance, and you follow a modern oil change interval, which isn't too insane to the levels of synthetic oil. I mean, like, come on. Do you really think GM is going to be putting all the money to making sure that every Chevette's got synthetic oil in the crankcase? I doubt it. Because you know what? Those cars are so disposable when they were brand new. Synthetic would have been a waste. So, I don't know. I just found it interesting that I was looking at some of these sales brochures, and with American domestic GM vehicles, they will have the service intervals in the sales brochure. If you look at any Chevy Nova, Chevy Sprint, Chevy Spectrum, they don't have a single, not a single one has a little table of when to do your basic services. Because they're already going to be bulletproof cars anyway. They can handle a bit more abuse. While the Japanese designed, it's like a German, I don't know, like a Japanese engine is more like German engineered quality, because you know the Japanese are going to take time in designing a good engine, but they're going to make them robust enough like a Russian Lada. And then German engines are just German in design and German in build quality, and they're great until you abuse them, and then they're not fun anymore because something happens and you gotta fix it. Japanese cars, you can give them abuse and they'll take it, but their engineering is quite fantastic. I'd say American cars, or American engines, they're much more robust, but I don't know how well they handle abuse over time. Now, I'm not talking about heavy loads. I'm just talking about a lack of oil changes. Eventually, that is going to damage moving parts in an engine, especially with transmissions. If you have an automatic transmission, especially older types, oh God, your bands are going to be gone. So, I don't know. I just felt it was interesting to share a little bit about the possibility that service intervals killed a lot of these cars. A lot more before rust did. So that's why if you've ever seen, like, in the 1990s, literally all of these cars that I showed you were all around, except for getting into their older years, or their later years, and they're starting to show their age at a relatively young age. But even a 1980 Chevette would have been off the road fully, even in its 20th year in 2000. Just would not last long. I can't tell you the last time I remember seeing a Chevette on the road, like being driven daily. 2010. So that car was 30 years old at that time, and last time I saw a Chevette was on a highway off-ramp, so it was using the highway too, so I can't imagine the difficulty of getting that thing up to speed, especially the possibility that it lost compression along the way. Whether if it was due to engine build quality or just quality of engine service, no one will ever know. So you have to consider. You want to keep your car long on the road, you may as well take care of it. You may want to make sure that, unless it's synthetic oil, don't push engine oil past beyond 3,000 or 4,000 miles, because it's just not a good idea. And domestic cars, you can go 60,000 miles on gear oil change for transmissions. And on imports, you can go 30,000 because they don't have filters. So I say do your research. If you own a car, it's not a bad idea just to check what your service intervals are and what you're comfortable with doing. And you know what? Dealership don't care when you should get your oil change. Hell, if you want to do it 1,000 before it's due, they don't care. They're getting your money anyway, so it doesn't matter. Hey, you might save your engine. Might keep it on the road a lot longer by changing it more frequently. So, hope you enjoyed my very, very confused rambling on service intervals. So, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.